All
Okay, excellent.
right.
Yeah, thank you. I know the two platforms is this is high tech, man.
Yeah.
So so we've of course been talking a lot with our students and then other Gnostic brothers and sisters and friends and people in general about boy these days it's really easy to get very consumed in emotions that feel very, very real. And in some sense, like lowercase r, of course they're real. Of course, fear arises in us, anxiety, sadness, the feelings related with loss of freedom, loss of a job, loss of a loved one. Those feelings are certainly real. We have to understand, as Christian was talking about, this is the part of the value, part of the great value and why in Gnosis we study the three brains and the five centers, the three brains, the intellectual, the emotional, and the brain of action. And it's so that we understand those are related to what we would call the inferior centers. And it doesn't make them wrong or bad, not inferior as in worthless, but simply to emphasize there are superior centers that we have that are able to perceive what really is closer to the truth, which brings us to why bother to study, for instance, the tree of life, because it helps us to understand that we live in a multidimensional universe and we ourselves are multidimensional. And the subtler we go in those dimensions, the closer to conscious truth we are, the closer to the absolute we are, the closer to whatever we call God we are. And the superior centers, the superior emotional related with the heart, the superior intellectual related with the crown chakra, the Sahasrara, are more receptive and sensitive to or sensible towards those superior planes, those superior dimensions. And so and in Buddhism, it's also talked about there's capital R reality and there's little r reality. And we've got to keep those in perspective. And it's not to become cold or to dismiss our own feelings or the feelings of others that are coming up in times like these. It's not to do what we could call a spiritual bypass and say, well, I'm so conscious, I'm above feelings, and just use it as an excuse to repress and not feel or judge or criticize. Right? So that's not the work. That's definitely not the work. In fact, that's writing backwards is what that's doing, because we can stay stuck in that for a long time of not letting emotions move through us, but letting them move through us with the consciousness present, the perspective of the consciousness, and not losing our sensibility, not losing our sense, which means to not lose contact with the superior emotional and the superior mind or the inner mind. So to not lose consciousness, which would be to not become identified, to not just become submerged in the feelings that are coming up around what's going on. And when we can do that to the best of our ability and as much as possible, then emotional alchemy becomes possible. What Christian was just talking about in terms of transforming lower elements into higher elements. And when we think about that, okay, what does that mean psychologically for me? What does that mean mentally and emotionally? It would be to transform those denser states, that despair or that fear. And we can, if we pay attention to ourselves, we can notice those types of feelings have density, that anger that we might feel about an injustice. That's something that's coming up, fear and frustration with our students in Canada, because there's a lot of concern about a potential rapid loss of civil liberties going on. And so that's on people's minds. And there's this feeling of injustice and this fear that comes up to want to protect oneself and one's way of life. And they feel, and they are again, real. And it feels so real, but we can't lose ourselves in that, or we just become part of the problem. Really, we just become lost in unconsciousness, in the labyrinth of our own unconsciousness, of our own subconsciousness, along with anybody else who's not working on their consciousness every day to keep it present. And if we don't like the decisions that are being made out of unconsciousness, then let's not go there, right? We've got to maintain our own consciousness at all times. And it's so seductive to fall into lower and negative emotions because they feel so real. And maybe for most of our life, probably, we've given them license. We've given them license as though it's their capital R reality. And they're not. And so to understand ourselves, to understand how are we, what are we made of? You know, how are we constructed? These three brains, but then we have these two superior centers that should be guiding those lower centers. That's why we use these words like lower, higher, inferior, superior. Again, it's not to make the emotional center bad or wrong. It's just to say, hey, little brother, little sister, you know, you're under the guidance of the heart, which is the root in ourselves physically and energetically of that superior emotional center. And you need to listen to that heart and take the guidance from the heart and don't stray from that, or you're lost. You know, you're lost, little brother, little sister out there, little mind, thinking your thoughts all day long. We know what that feels like, to be lost in that. And it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel strong. It might feel righteous in a way. It might feel energizing in a way, but it's exhausting. So Christian, I mean, I bring this up right off the bat because it's relevant. I think we feel, my husband Jeffrey and I feel like it's so important to right now speak to what's going on and contextualize the teachings in terms of, you know, the big elephant in the room, which is, hey, we're going through a huge global situation together that's unprecedented for any of us. And as far as we know, recorded history, what's happening in the world. And so it's important to point out these teachings that are very ancient, really, in their roots, are 100% totally useful and relevant in May of 2020 right now. So I don't know what that's bringing up for you, Christian, or what you might want to say to folks right now about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there is, a couple of things came to mind. First one, in relation to just, it always, I'm always so curious and surprised, really, when I hear all of these techniques to transform emotions and to awaken consciousness and to elevate our states of consciousness into higher states of being, that have been the foundation from so many ancient traditions, and that we're just beginning to catch up, and science is just beginning to understand, right, from a scientific perspective, that what the Buddha and Jesus were doing thousands of years ago, we haven't even really, when we think about it, we haven't even come close to it, because in Gnosis we talk about, as you were saying, experiencing higher states of consciousness. Once you have an experience of something better, then you yearn for that, right? Just like I always say, like if you've been eating food without salt your entire life, all of a sudden you eat with salt or with some spices, you're like, oh, this is so much better, right? And so I think that's where the one of the most healing benefits come from, working not just from a psychological point of view with emotions, but from a spiritual point of view, because our psychology, our mind, can only get us so far, right? And I think, unfortunately, we're beginning to see that. As I was talking to Carlos the other day, and how he mentioned this author that was saying, if you really think about psychology today, it's been about 100 years of psychology, psychotherapy,
modern Western psychology,
right? If anything, in the past 100 years, we've had psychology, but we've also lost spirituality. And you cannot help but notice that there's an increase in emotional and psychological illnesses. So we haven't gotten better because of psychology on its own. we've been missing that spiritual aspect, right? That
Mm-hmm.
makes us whole. And so this is where I think that why, again, it's so important to incorporate, as so many psychologists and psychotherapists now are bringing this um, mindfulness exercises and
Mm-hmm.
um, meditation practices into their office with their patients, because they
And
realize that with
doctors
the
as
mind they can only
well.
get so far. And doctors as well,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Now that they're seeing
Yeah,
the
yeah.
benefits physically and
That's right, because there's a scientific foundation, and a true Gnostic takes a scientific approach of application and observation, self-observation of what's going on inside as I'm applying the teachings, as I'm applying a practice, application, observation. We're Gnostics are doing scientific experiments all the time, so we don't separate from science or art or mysticism or philosophy. We have those four pillars integrated within the Gnostic teachings. And, you know, related with what you were just saying, we have to understand just looking at the word psychology has psyche in it, which means soul. So psychology properly is the study and development of the human soul. So if it lacks that, it isn't itself. So we should give it another name. We should call it something else other than psychology if that's not what we're doing. It might be
right.
mind, mentology, maybe, or something else, right? Right. But with all respect to, there's many psychologists, psychiatrists, people working in the mental health field that are bringing in spirituality. There's lots of Buddhist psychology out there. And in fact, this book that I think maybe spawned or influenced even this theme of emotional alchemy, right? There's this book, Emotional Alchemy, right, by Tara Bennett Goldman, who is in the field of Buddhist psychology very much. And I read that book many years ago. It's been a while, but she says in that book that Buddhist psychology, rather than emphasizing pathology and seeing that focus on pathology, which the sort of, we could say, so-called Bible of psychotherapeutic analysis that is the standard in the West, really has a pathological focus, because it's not starting from where the Gnostic master Samael and Bior says true psychology and true work on ourselves begin. The point of origin is the essence. That's where we need to begin with true psychology, is to understand ourselves as an essence with her consciousness, which is her faculty of perception. And if we lack that, we're not doing psychology. But Tara Bennett Goldman was really trying to get at that and saying that rather than emphasizing pathology, we offer a positive view of human nature, which is the true self, or in Gnosis, we talk about it as the essence. And she said that just as gold becomes tarnished, so the gold of the soul, we would put it in Gnostic terms, becomes tarnished, our true nature becomes obscured by habits and our emotional and mental habits that are repeated, the emotional and mental habits that are just spinning in the lower centers. So the lower instincts that are so tied to fear, right? And then they trigger those emotions related with fear and anxiety. And then the thoughts that come in to justify those feelings or reverberate those feelings and say, okay, what am I going to do? The instinct and the sensations and the emotions, and then the thoughts come in, and we abuse this beautiful faculty that we have as people of the intellect. And we become what in the teachings are called intellectual animals. So we're using this just brilliant faculty that we've been gifted as caretakers of the planet. That's a proper human use of the intellect that we've been gifted above other animals. We have this brilliant faculty so that we can tend to and care for all of those other creatures that don't have that faculty. That's our proper place in the world. But we rather use it when our instincts and our emotions are misguided. We use that beautiful mind to fortify with a lot of weapons and make atomic weapons, and to satisfy and gratify our desires, because fear often leads to greed. There's a direct connection between fear and greed because I feel like, oh, I better hoard. I better get more stuff and protection and right. And so we use this beautiful mind and we abuse it. But that's what happens when we're out of contact with the superior emotion and the superior mind. We're out of contact with that intuitive inner mind and the intuitive sense or sensibility of the heart and the superior emotional center. So that goes back to what I was talking about. We're tarnishing our own soul. We're tarnishing our own gold. And so we're working in the teachings, we're working in a real psychology to untarnish, to polish meditation practice after meditation practice, mindful breath after mindful breath, transmutation after transmutation, right? That every one of these actions is taking that polishing cloth to our tarnished soul and getting to that gold again. That's exactly what we're doing. So I really appreciated that metaphor that she used because it's so true, really. And we give the teachings of the three factors in Gnosis of death, dying to the tarnish, letting go of the tarnish, being willing to take our hand and say, okay, I'm willing to let go of that instinctive fear little by little and replace it with the gold of the higher emotions with faith. I'm willing to have enough trust to be willing to let that tarnish go that maybe got me where I am. Maybe it worked, and it's certainly maybe it was modeled for me as I grew up, but to be willing to let it go and replace it with faith, the beautiful strength of faith, because living in faith is a powerful way to live. Living in fear is a very weak way of living, and we know that because we feel it. We know that that's an unstable way to live, but until we come into contact with the consciousness and teachings that help us to maintain contact with the consciousness, we're like, this is all I've got. All I've got is fear. And so people clinging to their weapons and their hoarding might feel in a situation like, I don't know what else to do. I don't know what else there is. But if we're attracted to these kinds of teachings, we know inside, you wouldn't be here right now if you didn't know inside that there's something else. And you want that inside yourself, and you want that for others. And it's true. What you feel, what brought you here is true. And it takes courage. It takes courage. So yeah, Christian.
Yeah. I mean, that's one important aspect in that, you mentioned faith, and to have faith, one needs courage, and to have and courage gives you the ability to surrender, which is what faith is. And when we do that, we actually can begin to experience something new, right? As you said, we're stuck in this, these very few states of being. It just sort of reminds me of how Master Samael says he has that lecture called "The Small World in Which We Live In." We live actually in a very small world, right? We live in a very small world with just a few emotions, a few instinctual sensations, and that is so familiar to us that we're simply afraid to open up or to experience something new. And a lot of the times also laziness kicks in, and okay, I know that there's something there, but I have to meditate. I have to
right.
I have to put all these things aside and actually put some effort into it to accomplish it. But everything that we accomplish in life that we appreciate, it has come to us through effort, right?
That's
And
right.
so,
That's absolutely right.
yeah, and so the experience of higher emotions is the same thing. We have to make an effort, right? And this is where this whole concept of sacrifice and death comes into place. And as you mentioned to me before, that we have to overcome this false identification with oneself, right? We have this very limited perception of who we are, and this false feeling or self or limited feeling of self. And we need to expand beyond that, right? We need to do that. And in order to do that, we do need to allow ourselves to be guided by, the spiritual traditions and the spiritual practice. And and all of that.
Hmm.
So I think it's a very important point that you're bringing up, for sure.
Very. It just came to me as we were talking and you were talking that when I was a child, my mom had the silver set, and once a year, the set of silver, the silver, I don't know what it was, all the big spoons and all the fancy silver for, the Thanksgiving dinner, the Christmas dinner, that the kids, we would be the ones polishing the silver, once a year. And to take that rubbing cloth, and do that work. And yeah, it takes that willingness and that a certain amount of discipline, but a loving discipline, not love that we mistake for duty, because if we're just doing it out of fear or out of duty, it runs dry, it gets cold and we're just kind of whipping ourselves forward, that sort of false approach to penance.
Mm.
And then where we become kind of harsh upon others. And that can happen in a teaching like this, where that sincere, genuine drive that we have inside, that passion we feel in our consciousness, can again get misdirected into the lower emotions and become hardness, harshness, criticism, self-judgment, judgment of others. So we want to be careful about that as we polish the silver or the brass, right, or the gold, really polishing the gold that's become tarnished, it should inspire us. And that's when we know, oh, I'm connected to the superior emotional center because I feel joy, even if I'm crying tears because it's painful what I'm seeing about myself or what I'm seeing about the humanity. Sometimes is painful, but along with those tears of pain, there's an element of joy and liberation inside of that. That tells us that we are connected to the superior mind and the superior emotions. If there's always at least a thread, an element, molecules of joy and liberation and peace, that knowing that this pain I'm going through has a purpose for my soul and it could liberate others in a similar way. So there's always there's a joy in the work. And if we're not feeling joy in our psychological work, in our spiritual work, then we're not connected to our higher emotional center and our higher mind. I'm not saying, and I'm using the word joy, not happiness on purpose, even though they could be the same, but I think we get really confused and relate happiness with pleasure. And and it's not just about pleasure. That joy can come in some extremely unpleasant moments.
Yeah.
Real joy, deep contentment can come in very unpleasant moments. And that's why we need the equanimity that meditation develops and that self-observation develops. And again, not a coldness, but an equanimity, a contentment, an ability to be with things as they are, which is absolutely not coldness. It's presence. It's being very, very present because I'm with the consciousness, and only the consciousness is capable of presence. Otherwise, we're just self-controlling, and having that mentology active. We've made up a new word, Christian, mentology instead of psychology. And so we can try to cultivate ourselves as sharper minds and better people and better personalities, I could say, and have a lot of rules around how to do that. And our supposed psychology, really mentology, could fall into that. But no, we're talking about something very alive, very connected with oneself in the moment, very connected. I feel my sensations. I know what my lower emotional center is feeling and doing right now. I hear the thoughts on the back burner of my mind that are influencing how I'm listening to what I'm listening to and what I might say next if I'm not aware of myself, and create some space between impression and response. I need to create space. And that's what self-observation with remembrance of the being or connected to the superior emotions and the superior mind, feeling the consciousness awake. That's what that kind of self-observation does. A self-observation without that connection is mentology. I like this word.
Yeah, it reminds me when we were studying the labors of Hercules, and that labor of Hercules where Hercules is given the bell by what we know as the Divine Mother, right? And he has to kill these birds, and he uses the bell to startle them, and then once they start flying, then he can begin to kill them. And it's obviously the symbol is the consciousness, right? That without bringing in the consciousness, it's just mentology to continue to use that word, right? It's just the mind observing the mind, the ego observing the ego, the sadness, feeling sad at the fact that we are sad, or anger at the fact that we are angry, right? And so we need to bring that new element, which is consciousness, which is awareness, that we can only connect with when we sit down and connect, right, with that essential nature, right? And that's where the true alchemical transformation begins to happen, right? And I came across in that book that you mentioned, Emotional Alchemy. She has this beautiful quote. She says that alchemy is when trying to remember now, but she says something like, alchemy happens when the spiritual plane comes into contact with the material plane, right? And that's so that's in essence what we have to do, but we have to allow ourselves for that energy, right, to descend or to elevate ourselves to that energy, so that transformation can happen.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, we need to become more subtle, and I'm using the word, sensitive or sensible, but also more subtle and available, because when I'm only full of my own moods and my own memory-based thoughts, because the thinking mind is based in memories, so it's just regurgitating and maybe putting things together in different ways so it feels new, but the lower mind is regurgitating past information. It's memory-based. It's the superior mind that receives, and that's the symbol of the upturned Buddha's bowl or the chalice that might be on an altar of those two different traditions, right? But it's the same symbol of that an inner mind, that intuitive mind, that available mind that is available to receive and not just projecting itself, which is the tendency of the dualistic type of thinking mind. So as Master Samael says, that the greatest form of intelligence is non-thinking, is to not think. And that's so counter to what we have typically in the West learned in school. If we went to schools that weren't teaching meditation, we were teaching and learning and being in mentology, learning that that's the approach to intelligence in life. And we were unfortunately misinformed about what intelligence really is. So now, thankfully, we're coming into contact with teachings that help us to understand what intelligence really is and what wisdom really comes from. And so we have this opportunity, and every tradition teaches in its own language that we need that dharma or that teaching, and we need a sangha or a community in order to put this into practice, because just sitting there by yourself with your little brass pot, rubbing for a while, you start to wonder, like, am I doing this okay? Am I doing this right? Do I still want to do this? We might get bored or distracted on our own. Yeah. So to come together in community regularly, this is fundamentally important. That every awakened master has emphasized that for good reason. And of course, then the third jewel, as expressed in Buddhism, in addition to the Dharma and the Sangha, is the Buddha, which ultimately is your own inner being that your consciousness takes you to. And meanwhile, it's your teachers who are ahead of you in that path, right? Like the Buddha, like a Master Samael, or even Christian, is giving guidance for that meanwhile. But I saw an interesting cartoon the other day that showed the Buddha and Jesus and Krishna walking together. And the caption said something like, do you think they'll ever realize that we're just stand-ins for their own being? Right. Right? That eventually we do recognize that, but meanwhile, we need to have the humility to know that we need that kind of guidance and support. And you mentioned earlier, Christian, that by and large, not entirely, and it's in different cultures. We're getting to know Canada a lot more, and how this is true there. But to a great degree, we're losing our religion, as the song says, that we're losing our spiritual contact, and a lot of that has to do, in our experience of talking with people about this and reading about it, of negative experiences. People have had their experience of religion has been fanaticism, or the lower emotional center and the lower mind taking the teachings and processing it and giving it back, and it lacks the sensibility of the superior centers and the sensibility of an alive consciousness, and therefore it's not taking people to their being, because that's not what's being given or taught or delivered. And so people, largely due to that, have turned away from religion. But unfortunately, then we're lost without any kind of spirituality. So Gnosis comes at a time like this to bring us back to the essence, to the essential aspect of what religion is about, which comes from the Latin religare, which means to reunite. It's synonymous with yoga, to yoke, to unite. To unite us with what? With our inner Buddha. With our inner Buddha. But it's hard to figure that out just all by yourself. We need that Sangha, we need that Dharma, we need the teachers as the Buddha, meanwhile. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very important aspect of the teachings, which I think unfortunately, because the way that religion has been taught or misused in the past, throughout history, we have this absolute distrust towards or any sort of organized group, right? But we have to be able to discern, right, and to be able to go beyond our fear and recognize and allow ourselves to experience that being with the group, being with the Shanghai, it's an important aspect of growth of the spiritual path.
Yeah.
So
Judith, speaking of the Sangha or Shanghai, I know there's been some chat coming in, so maybe we want to look at that, huh?
Yeah, so I saw a question here earlier. Let me try to go back to it. I believe it was Adina who asked this question. Okay, so yeah, there's a question here. What if there's hope in the pain for something better, but not joy? What if there is hope in the pain for something better, but not joy? So
where there's, okay. Yeah, so hope, I would say in my experience, and as I understand hope is very related with joy. Just think about it. When you feel hopeless, and we've all been there, and then imagine when you feel hope. When hope comes through from the hopelessness, what is that feeling like? What is the feeling of hope? Feel hope in your heart. Anything right now that you feel hope for, that you have hope in, let yourself feel it in your heart. And for me, that very feeling of hope is a form of joy. So I would say that hope is a type of joy, and it brings a type of joy, right? It's a subtle form of joy. Because in hope is freedom, right? In hope is possibility. In hope is inspiration. Hope and inspiration go together. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. I definitely agree. I've never thought about it, stopped to think about it, of that relationship that you explained between hope and joy. It's very interesting. We have one more question. Do lower emotions always move one further from understanding and truth?
Well, they're information. All of our emotions are valuable information for us. But what's happening if information is just going out and impulsing us without being processed by the consciousness? That's the question. And so it depends on what we do with them. It depends on emotions are part of the human experience. They're wonderful, they're magnificent, and they're really necessary. But then we are constructed, a human is brilliantly, perfectly constructed for the consciousness to be present. So our nervous system, like there's all this illness with the nervous system these days, and there's so much emphasis on the sympathetic aspect of the nervous system is overactive, and as we might have heard that in the States, it's measured by the Center for Disease Control, not some little organization, that 80% of illness is stress related. So there's lots of things going on with the human system in relation to lower emotions, right? Stress is a variety of lower emotions. And so, but we weren't built incorrectly. We were brilliantly designed, but for the consciousness to remain present. So this triple nervous system and the 7 systems that it commands, like the circulatory system, musculoskeletal, etc., it's a beautiful design. I mean, we are a map. We are the tree of life. I mean, the human system is gorgeous, so beautifully designed for the consciousness to be in a guiding position. So when we lose our consciousness in any moment, in any day, week, year, life, then we're that log out at sea, and it's a rough ride. It's a rough ride without the consciousness. Yeah. So that's what I would say about that. It depends on what is the consciousness present and witnessing that emotion arising and learning from it, because that's the place of contact between the cloth and the tarnished receptacle. That's the place, that's the work right there. Is like, there is tarnish there. And I'm applying my consciousness upon that tarnish. And I'm comprehending it. I'm understanding it. And from that place of contact, right there, my awareness and consciousness and the work as the cloth to do the rubbing, and the gold of the soul wanting to become brilliant again, light comes from that. The gold is the light of comprehension. That's what the gold really is. That's what we liberate gold from the pot. We liberate gold through that work that we do. So in a way, I mean, lower emotions are somewhat of a necessity in the sense that we need to comprehend them and do that work and liberate the light. That's what we're doing here. That's the purpose of a human life, is to liberate ourselves and to create that light and take that wisdom and light back to the absolute. Maybe getting ahead of ourselves here, but that's exciting work. Like that's the work of what it is to be human right there. So to try to deny or squish away or shove away or make wrong our lower emotions would be to miss that opportunity to create so much light through choosing faith over fear. So much light is created from that choice that an individual makes. And it's a wonderful feeling, but it also contributes. We are receiving from the higher planes, but when we're working on ourselves, we're also giving to the higher planes. And there's a reciprocity that affects the karma of the individual and the karma of humanity, of the world. It's a very dynamic, alive, important work. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Totally agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have another question. This is a very interesting one. One more question, and then I believe Judith, you have to leave us. So we'll just go to this last question. And just to actually, you said about the relationship between the emotions and our illnesses, and that actually links into our next talk, where Carly is going to join us next week, and she's going to talk about the hermetic origin of illnesses. So she's going to talk about
wonderful
that sort of esoteric aspect, right, of how illnesses arrive in the body, not just from a physical point of entry, let's say, but also that our mental states, our inner states create those illnesses. So it's just these talks are sort of connecting with each other, and that's wonderful to
They
see.
are, huh? Yeah, I was happy to hear that she was going to give that talk, and I'll be here. It's going to be brilliant for sure. Yeah, Carly's a great teacher. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's another question. Is it possible to be in the no mind state while thinking? Interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. Christian, what are your thoughts around that, or your non-thoughts around that?
Well, I would, it reminds me of what Master Samuel says, right? The highest form of thinking is non-thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we have the superior intellectual mind and the inferior intellectual mind. And usually
Mm-hmm.
our inferior intellectual mind is the mind that's always running mechanically without your control. But we have the opportunity to think with a quiet mind, which is when the mind simply becomes completely receptive, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or to even just focus our mind on one point and allow that thought to speak to us rather than answer back to that thought. A lot of the times we think of something and then we continue to explore that thought as opposed to, okay, here's a
Mm-hmm.
thought. What does this thought have to tell me? And then become
Yeah.
receptive to that thought. And in that moment, you think, and then you become receptive, and then you allow that thought to talk to you. So I would say yes. Ideally, I think that would be the ideal state most of
Yes.
the time.
Yes.
But Master Sama also referred to that as thinking profoundly.
That's
Right?
great. Yeah, that's from a story, right, where he was walking with someone and they were walking across the street, and the individual asked Master Samael, just, I need to know, are you thinking right now? Don't you want to ask a Buddha that? Like, are you thinking right now? And so he asked the question, and Master Samael looked at him and said, yes, brother, but very profoundly, right? Which doesn't mean a lot with the intellect. It is to reflect upon our own thoughts in a container of consciousness. And all you need to do is meditate to understand what we're talking about. Just apply simple meditation practices where you relax your physical body, you relax your mind, attend Christian's morning meditations, and get into that state where the vibration of the consciousness, and consciousness can be called a high vibratory frequency, is present, and you feel that, and then you notice your thoughts coming in to that atmosphere of consciousness. So again, we're beautifully designed. This thinking mind is beautifully designed for the consciousness to be present. And when the consciousness is present, then I can witness my thoughts and know where they're coming from. Is that a useful, edifying, helpful thought or not? If not, I'm going to let it go. If so, wow, interesting. Where did that come from? Maybe it was something I received. Maybe it's something from the past. Like when I was reminded, my memory came up with that memory that I haven't thought about in a long, long time, of when I was a child and my mother having us polish the silver. And that was a useful memory because it inspired me. It kind of tickled me and helped me realize, well, my mom helped me have the discipline that I need now to do this work. How beautiful is that? And it touched my heart. When I heard that memory inside, it touched my heart in that moment and gave me even more of the right kind of state that I need to give this talk. So that was a useful memory. But a lot of memories are not useful. A lot of thoughts are not useful. Some are, some are not, but only the consciousness knows. Mm-hmm.
All right, Judith, thank you very much for joining us. I know we're running out of time here. And again, thank you for making such sacrifice to share with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you all very much for showing up. Yeah, and keep with it, everybody. It's a wonderful work.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judith.
And if you are in the Vancouver area, you can get in touch with Judith and her husband Jeff. They're teaching in Vancouver now. You can find their Vancouver Gnostic Center, BC Gnostic Center. You can find her.
BC Gnostic Center, yeah. Gnosis BC.
Okay. Yeah. Or just send us a private message and we'll get you in touch. Okay. All right. Thank you again, Judith. I hope we
All
can see each
right.
other in person soon.
Thank you.
And yeah, we'll looking forward to the next one.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye for
everyone.
now.